still remember the way his coffee mug sat on the windowsill. Handle chipped. Rim stained from years of black coffee. No sugar. It was one of those small, silly things you don't realize you'll miss until silence settles where a voice used to live. You see, I was there when my father's last winter came. Not the kind of winter outside. That year, snow never even showed up. I'm talking about the quiet winter inside his body. The kind that creeps in slowly, like frost under a locked door. And I missed it. I didn't see it. Not when it mattered. He was 87 when it began, or rather, when it began to end. He still came out to sweep the porch every morning. Bless him. Still wore that threadbare cardigan with the missing button near the belly. But he moved differently. Slower. Like time had finally tapped him on the shoulder. Not suddenly. Just gently. I thought he was just tired. Getting old? I used to joke, nudging him with my elbow. He'd chuckle. You'll get here too, son. Just wait. I didn't understand the weight in his words. Not then. What I remember now, what presses against me on nights when sleep won't come, is how subtle it all was. How quiet. The world teaches us to expect drama, some grand signal before the end. But real life, I've learned, is quieter than that. Softer, and often more cruel because of it. It started with food. Dad didn't finish his meals anymore. Just picked at them, pushed things around his plate. I thought maybe his dentures were bothering him. I even booked a dentist appointment. Waste of time, the man barely let them touch him. Said he wasn't hungry. Said food didn't taste the same. Looking back, I should have known. But hunger, or the lack of it, isn't just about food. It's about the body whispering, I don't need this much anymore. I didn't hear that whisper. I only saw the uneaten soup. And then the weight loss came. Not dramatic. Not right away. It was the belt notch, an extra hole he made with a nail in the shed. It was the sweater that used to fit, now hanging loose on his frame. Are you eating enough? I'd ask. He'd shrug. I'm not wasting away, son. But he was. And more than his body, something else was fading. His laugh wasn't as quick. His eyes, once sharp enough to spot a crooked nail from 20 feet, now lingered longer in silence. One evening, we sat on the porch watching the light fade from the sky. He used to narrate the clouds like a poet, called them God's brushstrokes. But that day he just stared, long quiet, as if words were too heavy. That's when the stillness began. Not peaceful stillness. Not the kind you choose. This was something else. A surrender. A body and maybe a soul beginning to withdraw. And I didn't know how to name it. I thought maybe he was sad. I asked if he wanted to see the neighbors, the boys at the corner store, even old Uncle Ray from across the town. He smiled, polite. Maybe next week. There was no next week. What I'm trying to tell you is that the fading doesn't happen in shouts. It happens in whispers. It happens in skipped dinners and quiet gazes, and the way a man starts choosing silence over conversation. Not because he doesn't love you anymore, but because the world's volume is too loud for what little strength he has left. I wish I'd known. I wish someone had told me that fatigue isn't always solved with rest. Because there comes a time in an old man's life where tired doesn't go away. It settles in like an old tenant. Doesn't matter how long he naps, how early he goes to bed. The weariness stays. Not just in the body, in the spirit too. Dad started sleeping more. Longer naps during the day. He'd doze off mid-sentence, something he never did before. Chuckle. Getting comfy, huh? He'd grin. But his eyes didn't sparkle like they used to. And when he was awake, I could see him struggling to pretend he wasn't tired. He'd try to open jars even though his hands had grown weak. He'd still carry groceries from the car, swearing he was fine. But his knees wobbled, his breath shortened, and every now and then, I saw him sit down and stay down longer than usual. That kind of fatigue, it's not laziness. It's the body choosing what little it has left, choosing to conserve. He never said it out loud, but some part of him knew, the way animals know when it's time to curl up and let the forest take them. I didn't want to believe it, so I made excuses, blamed the weather, the salt in his food, the flu that had gone around that winter, anything but the truth, because the truth is hard. It breaks something in you to admit that someone you love is getting ready to go. And yet, if I could go back, I wouldn't waste time pretending. I'd sit with him longer on that porch. I'd hold his hand instead of filling the silence with weather reports. I'd say less and listen more, because sometimes the things people say when they're tired are the ones they've held back their whole lives. There was a day, late spring, I think, when I found him standing in the middle of the hallway, just still. He wasn't doing anything, just staring at the family portrait on the wall. "Everything all right, Dad?" I asked. He turned slowly, eyes searching mine like he was trying to place who I was. Not in a dramatic, sudden way, just unsure. A fog behind his eyes that hadn't been there the year before. "Yeah," he finally said. "Just thinking." But that wasn't the truth. He'd always been sharp, my father. Had a memory like a vault. Could recall the price of milk in 1957 and the name of every man he worked with at the mill. But in those months, little things started slipping. He'd forget where he'd placed his keys, though he never left them anywhere but the counter. He'd call me by my brother's name, at first just once or twice, then more often. He'd tell the same story twice in one sitting, then seem embarrassed when I reminded him. I didn't think much of it. Who doesn't get forgetful with age, right? But this wasn't normal forgetfulness. This was something deeper. It wasn't about memory, it was about disconnection. He started losing track of time. He'd get up in the middle of the night, dressed and ready for church, though it was Wednesday. He'd ask if I'd seen Mom. She'd been gone 12 years. That one hurt the most. He wasn't just forgetting moments. He was stepping backward through them, drifting into places only he could see. And when I brought it up, gently he'd brush it off. Just tired. Mind's playing tricks. Maybe it was. But maybe his mind was doing what old trees do before they fall, letting go of the leaves one by one. The thing is, nobody tells you what that looks like. Nobody prepares you for how quiet it can be. You picture dementia or decline as something loud, erratic. But this was subtle, tender even. He didn't fight it, didn't rage. He just slowed, started speaking less, sitting longer in silence. And when he did talk, sometimes it didn't make sense. Not to me anyway. He'd say things like, "Did the green dog come through here?" Or he'd ask me, "Where's the blue boat?" while looking out the kitchen window. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to correct him. But instead I nodded, because I realized maybe in his world there was a blue boat. Maybe that was where he felt safe. There's a point where logic no longer serves love. And that was the moment I stopped asking him to return to my world and started visiting his. Sometimes the people we love go away before their body does. And it's cruel, yes, but it's also a kind of mercy, because it gives you time to say goodbye in pieces, even if you don't realize it's what you're doing. I catch him staring out the window for long stretches, not watching anything, just being. Once, I asked him what he was thinking. He looked at me, soft and quiet. "I was remembering," he said, "but it feels like someone else's memory now." That's when I knew. He was slipping away, not because he wanted to, but because the weight of staying was simply too much. It wasn't sadness, really. It was surrender. And I don't mean giving up. I mean the kind of surrender that comes with age, when you stop wrestling the current and let it carry you where it will. Looking back, I think the part that haunts me the most was how often I filled the quiet. I thought silence was something to be fixed. So I'd turn on the radio. I'd talk about sports. I'd list the errands I ran. I'd chatter, thinking I was comforting him. But sometimes what people really need, especially near the end, is not noise. It's presence. The sound of someone breathing nearby. The feel of your hand on theirs. The warmth of knowing they don't have to perform or pretend. I wish I'd understood that sooner. There was this afternoon. I remember it like it was yesterday. He was sitting on the porch again, his sweater buttoned wrong, one shoe untied. I sat beside him, and for once I said nothing. He didn't speak either. We just sat. The sun made patterns on the floorboards. The wind moved through the trees. And after a long, still while, he reached over, not for my hand, but just to rest his on my knee. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. That was one of the most complete moments I've ever known. And it didn't need a single word. If you're still here, leave me a comment. Tell me if someone you love has ever faded quietly, the way mine did. Or maybe you're seeing it happen now. You're not alone. And sometimes just writing it out, just putting it into words, helps you carry it. Some mornings he didn't want to get out of bed. Now that might not sound like much. Who doesn't like to sleep in a little when they're older? But this was different. This wasn't laziness. This wasn't comfort. It was something heavier. I remember walking into his room, the curtains still drawn, the air a bit stale, and finding him awake, eyes open, just lying there. "You all right, Dad?" He blinked slowly, like it took effort to bring me into focus. "Just don't feel like move in yet," he mumbled. He stayed in bed most of that day, and then it became most days. He didn't seem upset. He wasn't crying or panicked, but there was something missing behind his gaze. Some fire, some flicker of the man I used to know. The man who once changed a tire in the pouring rain, who carved shelves by hand for every room of the house, who danced with my mother in the kitchen when they thought I wasn't looking. That man had grown quiet, not just on the outside but within. I tried to coax him out of it, brought over his favorite donuts, put on his old music. He smiled. He thanked me, but he stayed seated. And then came the little things. He'd get sick more often, just small colds at first, but they lingered. A sniffle turned into a cough into shortness of breath. I remember one time he scraped his hand on a cabinet. It bled for a long while. The bruise stayed purple for weeks. The body, I've learned, doesn't just give up all at once. It starts to slow down its repairs, stops bouncing back. And at first you think, he's just older now. But then you start to notice that cuts don't heal, that his hands are colder, that his lips seem pale no matter how warm the room is. I took him to the doctor, of course. They ran tests. Just part of aging, they said. But I knew it was more than that. His immune system had grown tired. He'd catch something, a cough, a stomach bug, and it would linger. Antibiotics worked, but slower. His energy came back, but only partway. And there was this emptiness, this sense that his body was trying, but not with the same determination it used to have. I saw it in the way he walked, too. Each step just a little more careful. Not because of fear, but because his legs didn't answer quite as quickly as before. He started holding onto the walls as he moved from room to room. And later, when I offered to bring over a walker, he refused. "I'll use the wall," he said, a little smile on his lips. Walls don't judge. There was a kind of dignity in that, and also a deep sadness. Because he knew, even if he didn't say it out loud, the wall wouldn't always be enough. There's something cruel about watching someone you love become small in the space they once owned completely. He built this house with his bare hands, my father, measured every board, hung every door, and now he moved through it like a ghost. Quiet, careful, fragile. I remember making tea one day just the way he liked it, 2 bags, no sugar. I brought it to him, and his hands shook as he reached for the cup. He spilled a bit, just a few drops, but he looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else, like they'd betrayed him. "It's all right, Dad," I said quickly, grabbing a napkin. "It's nothing." But he looked up at me with eyes full of something I can only describe as shame. He didn't say it, but I could hear it anyway. I used to be strong, and he was. God, he was. But strength, I've learned, changes as we age. It's no longer in the muscles or the spine. It moves inward, into silence, into patience, into the bravery it takes to let someone help you without flinching. I didn't see that at the time. I was too focused on getting him back to normal. I see now how wrong that was. One night, I found him sitting in the dark. Not asleep, just sitting. The TV was off. The lights were off. Just him in his chair, eyes open, breathing slow. "You okay, Dad?" He nodded once. Just being. I didn't press. I sat beside him, let the quiet stretch between us. And after a while he said, "Do you remember the lake?" "Which one?" "The one we used to fish at. When you were small." I smiled. "Of course. Lake Delmore." He nodded again. Good place to be still. You didn't have to talk much out there. We stayed like that in silence for what felt like an hour, and something in me shifted. I realized then he wasn't waiting to die. He was trying to live in what little he had left. Not rushing, not resisting, just being. And that was a kind of wisdom I hadn't been old enough to understand. Until now, the breathing was the last thing I noticed. Not the stopping of it, no, not yet, but the change. Came on so gradually, I almost missed it like everything else. He started sighing more often. Deep, unprompted breaths like he was carrying something too heavy on his chest. At first, I thought it was just weariness. He'd always been a man of few words, and even fewer complaints. But then there were pauses, not in speech, in breath. We'd be sitting together in the living room, him in that old recliner with the patched leather armrest, and I'd catch it, a moment where his chest stopped rising, just for a beat, then a sharp inhale, like he'd remembered to breathe again. I didn't want to make it a thing. I told myself it was allergies, dry air, maybe he was just thinking deeply, but it got worse. Sometimes he'd fall asleep and his breathing would grow ragged, slow at first, then suddenly fast. A rhythm I didn't recognize. Once, he gasped so loud it woke me from the next room. He didn't even know it had happened. I looked it up online. Found words I didn't want to read. Shane Stokes breathing. Pre-terminal signs. I closed the laptop. Because once you read those words, you can't unread them. Once you know what they mean, you start watching differently. I began checking if his chest was rising every time he napped. I'd lean in just slightly, pretending to fix a blanket or bring him tea, just so I could count the seconds between his breaths. And his skin, it changed too. The color shifted in small ways. His fingers looked more purple some days. His feet, colder. He'd sit with a blanket even when the room was warm. I'd ask if he was cold. He'd shake his head, but his hands would stay buried beneath the fabric. I started noticing the little blue in his lips. Just faint. Just enough to make your stomach twist when you're the only one seeing it. Circulation. That's what the hospice nurse said later. The body conserving energy, sending what it could to the heart and lungs, and letting go of the rest. The strange, how the body chooses what to hold on to. He wasn't in pain. That was the blessing. But he was tired, bone deep tired. And even though he never said the words, I could feel it in the way he looked at me, like someone who'd already made peace with what I was still trying to deny. One evening, I found him sitting by the window. The sun was low, casting that golden light across the floor, the kind you only get for 5 minutes a day. He was wrapped in 2 blankets, even though it was late spring. His breath shallow but steady. Pretty light today, he said softly. Yeah, I whispered, as if too much volume might shatter something sacred. He didn't speak again for a while. Then, without turning, he said, "Don't be afraid when I go quiet. That's just me getting ready." I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice not to crack. Because what do you say to that? What can you offer a man who gave you everything, when you know you're running out of ways to give it back? I started sleeping lighter. Started leaving my door open just a crack so I could hear if he stirred. Some nights, I'd sit by his bed, not because he needed anything, but because I did. To listen, to watch, to hold on to every second. And I noticed something I hadn't before. He no longer reached for things. Not books, not cups. He no longer shifted in his sleep like he used to. The stillness, it had settled into his bones. The effort of living had become too much. And that's when I realized he wasn't fighting. He wasn't even waiting. He was resting, truly resting. Not the kind of rest that recharges you, but the kind that welcomes you home. I once asked him, maybe a week before the end, "Is there anything you want, Dad?" He thought for a long time, then said, "No, just this." He didn't mean the bed, or the blanket, or the cup of tea on the nightstand. He meant the moment, the stillness, the presence. Me beside him, that was all. We spend so much of our lives rushing, fixing, doing, trying to pull people back into our pace. But some journeys, some endings, aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be witnessed, to be honored. I didn't know that before. I thought love meant action. Now I know. Sometimes love means stillness.